Fred Rogers walked onto the Tonight Show stage on a Tuesday evening in March of 1982 and within 90 seconds had done something that nobody in that building had managed to do in Johnny Carson's 19 years as host. He made the king of late night go completely, utterly still. Not the polished stillness of a professional broadcaster gathering his composure. The other kind. The kind that happens when someone reaches past every defense you have spent a lifetime constructing and touches something you forgot was there. The studio audience laughed at first, assuming it was a bit, assuming that Johnny, the sharpest mind in American television, was simply letting the moment breathe. But Ed McMahon, who had sat 6 feet from Johnny Carson through 8,000 episodes, saw something different. He saw the look. The one he had learned, over 20 years of friendship, meant that something real was happening. Not television real. Actually real. Whatever Fred Rogers had just said quietly enough that the boom microphone barely caught it had cracked something open inside Johnny Carson that Ed McMahon had never seen cracked before. Not by celebrities. Not by presidents. Not by 30 years of American life pouring through that stage. Fred Rogers. Mr. Rogers. The man in the cardigan who sang softly to children about feelings. That man had just stopped the Tonight Show dead with 4 words. And the secret of what those words were, and why they landed the way they did, would stay locked inside 2 men for the rest of their lives, revealed only in the things they left behind. The letters. The photographs. The things their children found in drawers. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because this one is going to stay with you. Tuesday, March 9th, 1982. NBC Studios in Burbank, California. The Tonight Show was taped at 5:30 in the afternoon, the broadcast held until 11:30 that same night, the machinery of American entertainment running with the precision of something that had been doing this long enough to stop thinking about it. Johnny Carson arrived at 3:45, as always. His dressing room door closed behind him, as always. The hours between arrival and taping were his alone. His staff knew not to interrupt unless the building was on fire. What happened in those hours was something Johnny guarded more fiercely than almost anything else in his public life. He prepared. Not with joke writers or celebrity briefings. Johnny Carson prepared the way a chess player prepares, by thinking 3 conversations ahead, by reading everything written about the person sitting across from him. He had been preparing for Fred Rogers for 3 days.
Before we continue our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you're subscribed. It's free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
That surprised even Johnny, in a way he could not quite articulate. Fred Rogers was not, on paper, a complicated figure. He was the gentle man in the cardigan. The soft voice that greeted children every afternoon on public television. There seemed to be nothing to prepare for. No edge to find. No gap between public image and private reality. What you saw with Fred Rogers was, by every available account, exactly what you got. And yet Johnny had spent 3 days reading. He had read about Rogers's childhood in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, a heavy and lonely boy bullied for his quietness who had retreated into music and puppets and the private world of his imagination. He had read about Rogers walking away from a music career in 1951 after seeing a man throw a pie in someone's face on television and thinking, with complete clarity, that there had to be something better a person could do with that medium. He had read about Rogers's Senate testimony from May 1969, when Senator John Pastor arrived ready to cut $20 million from public broadcasting and instead sat in silence while Rogers spoke about helping children understand that their frightened feelings and angry feelings and sad feelings were all part of being human and none of them were shameful. By the end, Pastor approved the full budget without another word. But it was not any of those things that stayed with Johnny longest. It was a small detail from a Pittsburgh newspaper profile. The journalist had asked Rogers why he always changed into his cardigan at the beginning of each episode. It was such a routine part of the show that most viewers had stopped noticing it. And Rogers had said, "They were knitted by my mother. Every cardigan I wear on the show was made by her hands. When I put one on, I remember that someone loved me enough to do something that careful with their time." Johnny had set the clipping down very slowly on his desk. He had not read anything else for the rest of that afternoon. Fred de Cordova knocked on the dressing room door at 5 o'clock. 30 minutes to taping. "Johnny? You all right in there?" There was a pause before Johnny answered. "I'm fine, Fred." Just 2 words. But de Cordova, who had been watching Johnny Carson closely for a decade, stood in the hallway an extra moment before walking away. Something was different. He could not say what. He just knew. Down the corridor in the green room, Fred Rogers sat with his hands folded in his lap. He was 53 years old in 1982, wearing a blue cardigan over a collared shirt, his sneakers on his feet, his expression one of unhurried calm. The green room at NBC Burbank was not a tranquil space. It was frequented by people whose nervous systems were calibrated to the frequency of performance, people who tapped their feet and rehearsed their stories. Rogers sat in the middle of all of it, and was simply there. A 22-year-old production assistant named Gary Marsh had been assigned to keep Rogers company. He would tell this story to a journalist 27 years later. He said he had walked in prepared to make small talk and had instead found himself, within 5 minutes, being asked by Rogers how he was really doing. Not the social formality. The actual question. Gary answered more honestly than he intended to, admitting he was lonely in Los Angeles, that he had moved from Ohio 8 months earlier and still had not made a real friend. Rogers listened without interrupting, without the slight forward lean of someone waiting to respond, without any of the signals that mean a person is hearing you but not actually listening. Then he said, "Gary, the feelings you are describing are the feelings of someone who is paying attention to his life. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to be grateful for." Gary Marsh cried in the green room of The Tonight Show. He had never told anyone that until 2009. That was who Fred Rogers was before the cameras were even rolling. Stay right where you are, because what happens when these 2 men are finally in the same room is something that no one in that studio was prepared for. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from tonight. The taping began at 5:31. Johnny's monologue was sharp and assured, the timing immaculate. The first guest, a film actress promoting a picture opening that weekend, sat beside his desk for 14 minutes and left to solid applause. Everything running exactly as it was supposed to run. And then Ed McMahon leaned into his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. "He is the creator and host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. A man who has spent more than a decade showing the children of America that they are valued exactly as they are. Please welcome Fred Rogers." The applause was different from what had greeted the film actress. Everyone in the studio that night used that same word later when they described it. Different. Not louder, not more enthusiastic in any measurable sense. But carrying something the earlier applause had not carried, something that had to do with the difference between recognizing a name and meaning it personally. Rogers walked through the curtain at the pace he always moved, without any awareness that the situation called for a different pace, and the audience responded to that absence of performance with a warmth that went somewhere deeper than entertainment. He reached Johnny's desk and extended his hand. Johnny shook it and held it a beat longer than he typically did. The camera operator on camera 2 would describe it years later as the slight pause of someone recalibrating, like reaching for something familiar and finding it warmer than expected. Rogers settled into the guest chair. He looked at Johnny with the expression he was famous for, the expression that children understood instinctively and adults forgot they could understand, the expression of someone who is looking at you and finding nothing there that concerns them. The first 10 minutes of the interview were, on the surface, exactly what a Tonight Show segment with a public television personality was supposed to be. Johnny asked about the origins of the neighborhood, about Daniel Tiger and Lady Elaine and the land of make-believe. Rogers answered every question with the same quality of attention he had given Gary Marsh in the green room, full and unhurried, as though the question deserved more than a television answer. The audience laughed at the right moments and fell quiet at others in that involuntary way that happens when someone on a stage is saying something that is, somehow, also about you. And then, without entirely planning to, Johnny asked about the cardigans. It was not on his index cards. Something in the rhythm of the conversation had led him there, and he had followed without deciding to. He asked, almost casually, whether the sweaters were a costuming decision or something more personal. Fred Rogers looked down at his cardigan for a moment. Then he looked back at Johnny. He said, "They were knitted by my mother? Every one of them, throughout her life, made by her hands for me to wear on the show. I wear them because it matters to me that the children watching understand that someone made something with great care for someone they loved." He paused. "A handmade thing is proof that someone was paying attention to you. That someone thought you were worth their most careful work." Johnny nodded slowly. He picked up an index card and set it back down. He said, "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable." Rogers said she was. "She knew me." He paused. "That is the rarest gift one person can give another. To simply know them. Not who they perform. Not who they try to be. But who they actually are underneath all of that." And that was when Fred Rogers turned to look at Johnny Carson directly. He turned with the slow, complete attention that was the signature of his work, the presence that had made 30 million children trust him through a television screen. And he looked at Johnny the way he looked at children when he wanted them to understand that what he was about to say was true. And he said 4 words in a voice so quiet that the boom microphone almost lost them. He said, "Johnny, she knew you." The studio went still. Not silent in the technical sense. The microphones were live, the cameras rolling, the lights burning at full intensity. But the quality of the room's attention shifted in a way that every person present would remember in the same terms, years later, when asked about it separately. Something had happened that was outside the grammar of a television taping. Something that had no procedure and no precedent in the 19 years that stage had been doing this work. Ed McMahon looked at Johnny. The camera operator on camera 2 described leaning forward without realizing he had done it. The 300 people in the audience, who had been doing everything a Tonight Show audience was supposed to do, simply stopped doing any of it and waited. Johnny Carson pressed both hands flat on the surface of his desk. He looked down at the desk for a moment. Then he looked away from the camera, toward the wings, toward somewhere that was not the audience, and was not Fred Rogers, and was not the millions who would watch the broadcast that night. He looked toward something that was not in the studio at all. His shoulders moved once in a way that was not part of any performance he had ever given. He did not speak for 11 seconds. 11 seconds on the tape of a show designed to run with the precision of a watch is an eternity. The director's voice came through the production booth in a near whisper. "What do we do?" Nobody answered because there was nothing to do, because whatever was happening in front of those cameras was happening, and the only available response was to let it happen and not look away. Fred Rogers did not look away. He sat with the same stillness he had brought to the green room, to the handshake, to every moment of that evening. He waited, the way a person waits who has understood for a long time that some things cannot be rushed, and that rushing them only damages them. What Rogers said next was something Carson did not speak about publicly for the rest of his life. It lived in the fragments they left behind, in the letter Rogers wrote that spring, in the photograph Johnny kept for 23 years. But the people close to both men understood, over time, the shape of what had been said, because they could see its effect. Rogers said quietly, "I know that what I just said landed somewhere. And I want you to know that whatever you are feeling right now is not something to be embarrassed by in this room. This room is safe." He paused. "The people who could not give us what we needed when we were young sometimes leave a hunger in us that we spend our whole adult lives either trying to feed or pretending does not exist. Neither of those things is easy to live with. And neither of them is a flaw in you. You have spent 30 years making people feel better about being alive. That kind of work does not come from nowhere. It comes from knowing what it feels like to need that. From having needed it yourself." Ed McMahon stood up from his chair. Not dramatically, not with any performance in the gesture. He simply stood, the way a person stands when someone nearby has been hurt, and standing seems like the only honest physical response to helplessness. Johnny Carson did not cry. That matters to say clearly. What happened was not a breakdown in any conventional sense. What happened was something quieter, and in some ways more striking than tears. He turned back to face the camera. And for just a moment, barely 5 seconds, he looked like the boy from Norfolk, Nebraska, the boy who had learned very young that the most reliable thing you could do with your feelings was to make them funny or make them disappear, and he had not quite managed either one. Then he looked at Fred Rogers and said, his voice level but carrying something new in it, "That was not where I expected this conversation to go." Rogers said, "I know. I am sorry if it was too much." Johnny shook his head slowly. He said, "No. It was exactly right. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, do it right now. Hit the hype button if your platform shows it. Because what follows is the part that stayed with everyone who witnessed it longest. Drop your location in the comments. Tell me where in the world you are watching from." What followed was 22 minutes of television that de Cordova would say, years later, was the most unusual and the most human thing he had produced in a decade on that show. Johnny and Fred Rogers talked. Not in the architecture of a host and a guest. In the way two people talk when something true has been said and the only option is to follow it. Rogers talked about his own childhood loneliness, about the hours spent alone in Latrobe filling silence with music and imagination, about learning eventually to treat the loneliness not as something to escape but as something to listen to carefully. Loneliness, he said, is often the feeling of someone who has not yet found the right company for the particular person they are. Sometimes the right company turns out to be work you love, or an idea you cannot let go of, or the faces of children counting on you to show up the same way every day. Sometimes the loneliness turns out to have been the thing that made everything else possible. At one point Johnny said quietly that he had always understood his reserve, the famous emotional distance that every profile writer mentioned and every ex-wife mentioned, as a professional tool. Something he had chosen. The thing that allowed him to do this job without losing himself to it. Rogers was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The things we choose to become are often the things we became first by necessity. We choose them later consciously, because they worked. Because they kept us safe." He paused. The question worth asking, eventually, is whether you still need the same kind of safety. Or whether the walls that protected you then are doing something else now. Something that costs you things you would prefer to have. Johnny looked at him for a long moment and said, "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me on this stage in 19 years. Rogers shook his head gently. He said, "I think you have been surrounded by people who assumed you did not want honesty. That happens to people who are very good at seeming self-sufficient. The world takes them at their word." The 300 people in that studio had stopped being an audience in any conventional sense. They were sitting with their own versions of what was being said on that stage, each of them finding the particular room in their own life that the conversation had unlocked. A man in the 8th row stared at the stage with an expression his wife would describe, years later, as looking like he was hearing something he had been trying not to hear for a long time. De Cordova, in the booth, had stopped directing. He was watching the monitors the way a person watches a fire, because it was doing what it was going to do, and the only responsible thing was to make sure the cameras stayed on it. Near the end of the segment, Johnny asked Rogers what he would say to someone who had grown up and carried a childhood's weight into adult life and could not figure out how to set it down. He framed it as a general question. About a person. Everyone in the room understood it was not a general question. Rogers did not answer immediately. He sat with it. Then he said, "I would say that the fact that you are still carrying it means you still believe something could have been different. And people who believe things could have been different are people who can still imagine change." He paused. "I would say that the love you needed and did not receive is not gone. It did not dissolve because it was not answered. It is still alive in you. And everything you have done with your life, everything you have built and given and created, has been one long attempt to give it somewhere to go." He looked at Johnny steadily. "You have been giving it away for 30 years through that desk. To people who needed it. That is not nothing, Johnny. That is the best possible thing a person can do with a hunger they were handed that they did not choose. Johnny sat with those words for a moment in the particular way you sit with words that have rearranged something inside you and you are not yet certain what the new arrangement looks like. Then he said, very quietly, "That is why 30 million children watch your show, Fred." Rogers shook his head gently. He said, "I think it is because they recognize someone who is trying to be honest with them. Children always know the difference between being spoken to and being performed at. Adults know the difference too. They just forget that they know." The segment ended. The studio exhaled. All 300 people at once, releasing something simultaneously, the way a room sounds when a piece of music ends that has held everyone in it suspended. After the taping, Fred Rogers knocked on Johnny Carson's dressing room door. Guests did not seek out Carson after segments. The closed door was a boundary everyone understood. But Rogers knocked, and Johnny opened the door, and they spoke privately for 20 minutes while the rest of the staff moved through the building around them. A production assistant who walked past twice heard nothing but the low murmur of two voices, unhurried, the rhythm of a real conversation between two people who were not performing for anyone. Rogers left at 7:15. As he walked toward the exit, he stopped when he passed Gary Marsh. He said, "Gary, I hope you call your family in Ohio this week." Gary did. That same night, he called his mother from his apartment in West Hollywood at 10:30 and talked to her for an hour. He said it was because of what Rogers had said to him, but also because of what he had watched happen between Rogers and Carson that evening, because witnessing that conversation had made him feel, in a way that had no precise explanation, that it was safe to need people. That needing people was not a weakness but simply the condition of being alive and the beginning of everything that made being alive worthwhile. The broadcast aired that night at 11:30. The response that followed was unlike anything the show's viewer response team had encountered in years. The calls and letters were not primarily about Rogers. They were about Johnny. People wrote about the 11 seconds of silence. About the way his hands had pressed flat on the desk. About the way he had looked away from the camera towards something that was not there. They wrote about recognizing it. About seeing in the most composed and armored man in American television something they knew from their own lives. The particular shape of someone who learned young that the safest thing you could do with your feelings was to make them useful, or make them invisible. One letter, from a retired teacher in Akron, Ohio, said, "I have watched your show for 19 years and I have always admired your control. But on Tuesday night I understood for the first time that control is something you learned, not something you are. And I recognize that because I learned mine in the same place, from the same kind of silence." Johnny Carson kept that letter. Fred Rogers wrote to Johnny that spring. A handwritten note on plain stationery. Johnny's longtime personal assistant said she remembered it because she had rarely seen him read a piece of mail more than once. That one she saw him read 3 times before he folded it back into its envelope. He did not talk about that evening publicly for the remainder of his career. When journalists asked about his relationship with Rogers, he would say that Rogers was the most genuinely good person he had ever met in 40 years of television, which was true, but not the whole story. The whole story was something he held carefully, and in private. But it showed, in small ways, to the people who knew him well enough to look for it. Fred Rogers died on February 27, 2003, at 74 years old, diagnosed with stomach cancer in January and gone within weeks, the speed of it shocking people who had assumed on some level that someone so deliberately good was not quite fully subject to the ordinary mathematics of mortality. Johnny Carson, who had retired from The Tonight Show in 1992 and was himself in declining health by 2003, learned the news from his assistant, and sat quietly for a long time before saying anything. Then he said that Rogers was the only person he had ever sat across from on that stage who was not performing. He was just there. He was just himself. And I did not entirely know what to do with that until afterward. Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005, at 79 years old. Among the personal effects his family found in the years after his death was a framed photograph on the desk in his Santa Monica home. Not of any president he had interviewed, not of any of the decades of legends who had sat in that guest chair. A photograph from March 9, 1982. Two men sitting across a desk from each other. One of them in a cardigan, looking at the other with complete and unhurried attention. The other one looking back in a way that was slightly different from every other way he had ever looked at anyone across that desk. His son Christopher asked him once, in the last years of his life, why that photograph in particular. His father was quiet for a moment in the way he was often quiet. Then he said, "Because that is the only photograph where I look like myself." The documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor was released in 2018 and included a brief clip from the 1982 segment. Critics wrote that it demonstrated something Rogers had understood from the beginning, that the most powerful thing a person can do for another is to see them without judgment, and let them know they have been seen, and that this is as true for a 56-year-old television host as it is for a 4-year-old child frightened of the dark, and that the needs are not as different as we spend our lives pretending. The cardigans are in the Smithsonian now. 13 of them, each one hand-knitted by Nancy Rogers for her son to wear on television, proof that someone loved someone enough to do something that patient with their time. When you see a photograph of one under glass, think about what it means that he put on proof of being loved every morning before going to tell children they were lovable. Think about what Rogers understood from the beginning that most of us spend our whole lives trying to learn. That the love you were given and the love you give and the love you needed and did not receive are all part of the same current. That none of it disappears. That it moves through us and into the world in ways we cannot always trace. Think about Johnny Carson's hands pressed flat on his desk during those 11 seconds. Think about what it costs to carry something your whole life that you never chose to carry. And think about the extraordinary mercy of a moment when someone sits across from you, in the full light of their own unhurried attention, and says the thing you have needed someone to say for longer than you can clearly remember. Fred Rogers knew that children needed to hear they were loved exactly as they were. He spent 33 years passing that knowledge forward. What the March 9, 1982 Tonight Show made visible was that the children who needed to hear it did not stop needing to hear it when they grew up. They just stopped believing they were allowed to ask. And sometimes all it takes is one person, sitting across from you with nothing to sell and nothing to perform, willing to say it out loud anyway. Without being asked? Without waiting for permission. That is what Fred Rogers did on a Tuesday evening in Burbank, more than 40 years ago. And now you know the story? If this moves something in you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the hype button. Share this with someone who needs to hear today that the love they needed and did not receive is not gone. That the hunger they carry is not a flaw. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because this story is reaching people everywhere and I want to know where. And go call someone tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Tell them what Fred Rogers would have told them if he had the chance. That there is nobody else in the whole world exactly like them. And that is the most important thing in the world to know.